Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the International Center Goa. This is one of those unusual occasions when we have had an edition of Patrakar twice within 3 months. So we were lucky to be able to bring Chinky Sinha, editor of Outlook, a couple of months ago, was it? And today we have with us Dr. Sanjay Baru. And before I introduce him and Rohit Bansal, Mr. Rohit Bansal, please give a warm hand to both of them. So, Dr. Baru really needs no introduction. Off the cuff, I can simply say that he has headed 2 of the 3 leading business newspapers in the country. Mint was born much later, right? So he headed the Financial Times, Financial Express, and the Business Standard. He was editor of both these newspapers. And then he is, of course, better known as media advisor to Prime Minister, Mr. Manmohan Singh. And he is also the author of several books, famously, notoriously, The Accidental Prime Minister. But his most recent book is India's Power Elite, Caste, Class and a Cultural Revolution from 2021. He'll perhaps talk about a little bit about the next book that you may be writing. Okay, thank you. So we'll talk a little bit about his next book in the course of the discussion today. And thank you for coming and coming to Goa and joining us, Dr. Baru. Please. Mr. Rohit Bansal, I have known much longer than Dr. Baru, but I reconnected with him after about 35 years a few months ago. So Rohit currently is the group head of communications at Reliance Industries, but in his prior life, he was also a journalist. Right? So his journalistic career began more or less, I think, from what I could gather, around the same time as yours did, because Dr. Baru, before he became a journalist, he was an academic. He was a professor of economics at the University of Hyderabad. So it doesn't look like we have any economists here, but that's an alternative career for economists, make the jump from academia to business paper. So Rohit has been with Reliance for a few years now, but before that he was with the Economic Times, on television as well, and he is on the board of several leading media, was on the board of, or is on the board of several leading media houses, including Network 18, TV 18, Viacom 18, and the Editors Guild of India. Most recently, this year, he is listed in Home's list of top 100 in-house communicators in the world. So a very warm welcome to Mr. Rohit Bansal. Hi. Okay, so like we do every time we have Patrakar, or sometimes even when we have our ICG discussions, we'll try to keep things as informal as possible. That doesn't mean that you can have the floor all to yourself for 5 minutes. You cannot. Please keep your questions short, and there'll be plenty of opportunity for you to ask questions. We'll try to keep things interesting at our end. I'll just have a couple of questions to begin with, and then Rohit will take charge. And in between, we'll throw the questions. We'll ask you to come up with any questions. Please ask as many controversial questions as you like, because you are dealing with somebody who was the media advisor to the Prime Minister. He knows what to do with those questions. So okay, so that's about it. My first question, Dr. Baru, and I'm going to sit down very, very quickly, is the switch, as I could gather, was purely accidental from the University of Hyderabad to Delhi as to be part of the Times of India group. Looking back, what do you make of it? I mean, how did it happen? And how do you assess that change?
Since I began my professional life as a teacher, the first thing I used to say in my class, if the front row was empty, was to invite the backbenchers to come to the front. So why don't some of you sit more comfortably in the front row? I did start as a lecturer in economics at the University of Hyderabad immediately after I got my research degree. And for 10 years, I did what all academics do. I gave lectures, I gave seminars, I evaluated theses, and I lived the life of a teacher and an academic. It just so happened that in early 1990, I was invited to a party in my neighbor's house, and my neighbor happened to be the father-in-law of a very eminent journalist called T.N. Nainan, whom many of you would know. Nainan used to be with India Today for a long time and had just become editor of the Economic Times in April 1990. In fact, we met in April 1990. And he had read some of my columns. I used to write for the Economic Times even when I was in the university. So he said, you're writing, I like your writing, why don't you come and work for us for a year? Nayan's background was a corporate journalist. He used to write on companies and businesses. He said, I want someone with some knowledge of economics. So he made me an offer, which I took, partly because I'd done 10 years of this teaching business. I said, let me try something new. And as I was telling Pushkar earlier this afternoon, when I gave in a leave application to the Vice Chancellor for a 1-year leave, I was called in by the Vice Chancellor, who shouted at me for demeaning my profession of teaching and wanting to become a journalist. He said, you are insulting your profession. And it tore up my leave letter. So I was still a young, angry young man. So I said to him, sir, if you don't give me leave, I'll resign. He said, go resign. And that's exactly what I did. I resigned my permanent job with a pension at the end of 30 years. Coming from the middle class, it was a big decision to give up a permanent job with permanent benefits and take up a 1-year contract with the Economic Times. That's how I made the switch. But as I was again telling Pushkar, I think the year was what made the change. It was 1990. I joined the Economic Times in 1990 July, and in August the famous balance of payments crisis began as Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait and oil prices went up and our foreign exchange reserves started depleting. We had a political crisis with Vishwanath Pratap Singh losing majority, Chandrasekhar becoming Prime Minister. One thing led to another. And I have actually a book called 1991, which is one of the books I feel proud of. It hasn't done as well as I felt it should have, where I record the events of that year. It was a fascinating year for an economic journalist. On a daily basis, we were reporting what was happening to the economy. The slow beginning of the crisis, the sudden collapse of the rupee, foreign exchange reserves, India going to the IMF for the first time, the crisis in the politics of the country with Chandrasekhar government not winning the vote of confidence, elections declared, and Rajiv Gandhi's assassination, which made things even worse. It was such an exciting year for an economic journalist that not only did I decide to continue in journalism, but the Times of India management immediately promoted me from being an assistant editor to becoming the resident editor for the Delhi edition, and then I moved on.
Very, very interesting, going back to 1990, because that's around the time that Rohit and I finished college or master's degrees. And that's around the time, Rohit, that you would have, finished your master's, and that was around the time when you had your first encounter with Dr. Baru, right?
So early on in my life, ladies and gentlemen, I realized that it is useful to have one seniors on the right side. So these are two seniors of mine, and you can blame them for a lot of what I might say here on. Because for the simple reason that Pushkar Saab may not remember, but all remember our seniors a lot better. So he was 1 full year senior to me, in college, and he was quite a terror. He was not this gentle academic types that you see now, and seeing him like shadowing you around the mess at 8 o'clock when you were heading for dinner was a tricky one, because then he would say, "Chalo." And after dinner you would go, and then he would ask you very esoteric questions. None of them I could reply. And that's how it is. So I keep him on the right side. And of course, Dr. Baru, so I showed up in an interview where he was the chairman. And he was the resident editor of the Economic Times. And his first question was, in your essay you have written that you have A, B, C, D, I'll leave the names out, as your idols. I was a college kid, so I wrote some 2-3 famous journalists' name as their ideal. And he said, "These guys will be your ideal?" And then he looked away. That was the end of my chances of entering Economic Times. And then Subir Roy sort of took pity on a history honors types and said, "You know how to read a balance sheet, right?" I said, "No, but I can learn." He said, "Oh, okay, that's enough." And then I got into the Times of India. It so transpired that Dr. Baru had a very, very defining role in my career. He became the business and economics editor of Times of India, and I was just leaving for Mr. Nainan's offer. He was referred here to go to Business Standard. And Mr. Baru was abroad. So when he came back, he realized that Mr. Patgaonkar, the then editor, has accepted my resignation. Gone over, Mr. Baru was absentee. And I was about to go two blocks away to Business Standard. And then he blew a fit. He said, "How can you let my colleague go away like this from the business section?" So long and short is that Mr. Samir Jain had a very peculiar scheme, the owner of Times of India, that he would make Mr. Baru the director corporate, which was a big deal at that time. And the director corporate became the business editor of Times of India, which I don't know what he would do there. But so Mr. Baru, with one hand, gave me a double promotion in Times of India as the business editor, and with the other hand, he approved his own recommendation. So that's the defining moment in my own life. And this didn't just happen once. I mean, I'm going to keep it short, but unlike him, Pushkar Saab has called us for a program called Patrakar. Frankly, neither of us is a Patrakar anymore. So I don't know why he's named it Patrakar. But having said that, in his case, he was at least a distinguished Patrakar. I am at best an extinguished one. So we'll keep it there and stop.
So we're talking about 1990, and 1991 is another year which I think everyone remembers or knows. That's the year that economic liberalization, at least for most people, began. And what were you doing at that time? So you were with the Economic Times, and the next 5 years must have been crazy in many ways.
For a business journalist, for economic journalist, it was a fascinating time, because we had never lived through the kind of crisis situation that we lived through at that time. And we had Manmohan Singh as the finance minister, Deepak Nair as chief economic advisor. Deepak and I had actually been colleagues. In the 10 years that I was teaching in Hyderabad, I spent 1 year as a visiting faculty at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, where Deepak was a professor. And then he left and became chief economic advisor. So, unlike today, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the way government functions today, but in those days we had open access. You could walk into the finance ministry, knock on the door of anybody, including the finance minister, and walk in with a question, if you had a question. And that kind of access allowed us to report on a daily basis intelligently with information on what was happening. And I've said this to many students of economics, that if you can get hold of the newspapers of 1990, 91, 92, those 2-3 years, there's a PhD thesis waiting to be written there on the manner in which a turning point in India's history was reported. Frankly, if you look at the last 100 years, there are really 2 turning points. You know, the famous historian Eric Hobsbawm once defined a turning point, a landmark year, as an year in where there's general acceptance that something important has happened. As a historian, how do you decide which years are important? If there's a general social acceptance that something important has happened, that's a landmark year. On that basis, 1947 was a landmark year, and 1991 was a landmark year. There was a fundamental change in economic policy, industrial policy liberalization, exchange control liberalization, trade policy liberalization. Policies that were in operation for 2-3 decades, overnight were changed. It's the most radical change that was happening. And so reporting on a daily basis, and in the first year from 90 to 91 end, when I became resident editor, resident editor's job, those of you who are in journalism know, is more an administrative job. It's not writing. But in the first 12 to 15 months, I was writing the lead editorial of the Economic Times on a daily basis, 500 words every day, commenting on what was happening, the policy changes that were happening. A terrific education, but also we were educating people. I mean, I remember Nainan used to always make this point, that if you take the front page of any financial newspaper on budget, the day after the budget, till 1990, you look at the 1980s, 70s, the front page of the financial paper was always about cigarettes will cost more, petrol will cost more, or tax on, what is it, your guys used to produce, PMT, GMT, whatever it's called, chemicals, tax on something, customs, the headline was a decker, 3-4 decks of announcements, policy announcements. 91 changed that, because the headline was about fundamental macro policy changes, exchange rate liberalization, industrial policy liberalization, and then the whole focus of economic journalism moved from simply talking about these nitty-gritty changes to wider economic policy changes. I don't think we have seen another year like that in the field of economic journalism. I don't think we have seen another year in which such fundamental policy changes have happened in such a short period of time, which changed the direction of policy, changed the direction of the country. And I keep reminding people, if you read Manmohan Singh's budget speech of July 1991, and you read Nirmala Sitharaman's budget speeches of the last 5-6 years, Manmohan Singh's speech was not about what great things we have done. It was about the direction in which the country should be going. In fact, the famous last line of the budget speech was that from Victor Hugo, now my memory is failing me. The rise of India as an economic powerhouse is an idea whose time has come. That was the quotable quote from the speech. And the whole focus of that budget speech of July 91 and of February 92 was on how a change in economic policy was going to contribute to a fundamental change in the way the world would look at India. That here is a new India. I mean, we hear new India a lot these days, but that was really the turning point where the world began to look at India differently. India had opened up, and several factors, of course, contributed to this. The crisis was only one of them. The collapse of the Soviet Union, which began towards the end of 91. By December 91, the Soviet Union was no longer the Soviet Union. So it was, I think, a period in which there's so much to be written, and we had the opportunity to do that writing. So that's how I describe that year. That's why when I published this book called 1991, the title of the book is 1991. I tried to capture, in fact, each chapter of that book is each month of 91. First chapter is January, second chapter is February, third chapter is March. Month by month, from January to December 91. The changes at home, political changes, Rajiv Gandhi's assassination, Narasimha Rao becoming Prime Minister, the economic policy changes, and the international context, the collapse of the Soviet Union. All of them redefined almost the framework within which we were looking at ourselves and we were looking at the world.
So the way I thought I would organize, set up today's program is a couple of questions. Call it history, call it nostalgia. But when you mentioned 1991, I'll just a short bit to that, and then after which Rohit, you can, draw the connection from the past to the present, especially talking about the rise of digital media, its implications, what the newsroom means today, what the newspapers mean today. You have rightly said that 91 was a critical year, and then politically in economic terms. And I was thinking, obviously 2008 was not as dramatic. I mean, before that you had the Asian crisis, late 90s, but 2008 was again the Congress in power, right? I mean, what was different about 2008 for India?
That's an interesting question. 2008, as the crisis was building up in the US, I had actually left the Prime Minister's office in August 2008, and Lehman Brothers collapse was in September 2008. So I was not actually present there at that moment when what we call the transatlantic financial crisis. Normally in the literature it's referred to as the global financial crisis. But it was not global. It was essentially a crisis confined to the United States, to the UK initially, and then Europe. But in 2007, when I was still there, one day Bimal Jalan came to me. He had just been governor. Before that, I think by that time Venu Reddy had already become governor. Bimal Jalan came to me and said, I don't know if anybody is briefing your boss about what is happening in the world, but I've been doing some research and I have a note. Will you go and show this to Manmohan? And I must give credit to Dr. Jalan that he was one of the first persons I can think of who was drawing attention to what was happening on Wall Street and in the US and the implications of that. So Manmohan Singh, being a clever economist, immediately when he read the note, he understood what was happening and warned Venu Reddy, and I think between Montek Ahluwalia, who was in the Planning Commission, and Venu, who was in Reserve Bank, Rangarajan, who was chairman of Economic Advisory Council. I mean, you had four stellar brains handling the economy. They took a lot of steps to ensure that the impact of what was about to happen in 2008 would not hit India. As a consequence, we escaped the initial impact of 2008-2009. The impact on India, in fact, happens after 2010, partly because the 2009 elections we had, the government spent a lot of money before the election, and that excessive spending created a domestic fiscal crisis. But in 2009, now what am I saying? 2008, towards the end of 2008, when the 11 collapse had already happened and the US was already in a very serious financial crisis, Nicolas Sarkozy, who was the president of France, was in Canada, and he understood what was happening, and he understood that Europe could not be saved without help from America. So he flew down to Camp David, where George Bush was spending his weekend, and the two of them decided that there had to be a global conference to deal with the crisis. And they called Manmohan Singh and said that, look, there is an organization, an outfit called G20 Finance Ministers meeting. G20 Finance Ministers was created after the Asian financial crisis in 1997. So by 2008, there was already a G20 Finance Ministers meeting, and they decided to elevate it to a heads of government meeting. And the first G20 heads of government meeting happened in Washington or Philadelphia towards the end of 2008. Manmohan Singh went there prepared, thanks to all the homework done at home between Rangarajan, Montek, Bimal and Venu, with a note. And if you read the autobiography of Barack Obama, he writes there, because that was the year in which Bush was handing over to Obama, that winter, that Manmohan Singh was the teacher in the room of the G20 heads of government. And the three summits that happened one after the other, Philadelphia and then London and then back in the US, got control over the situation. And we were able to insulate. I think the mistake we made when you look back on that period is that we thought the crisis was over. We thought, we had escaped the crisis. It hit us by 2010, 2011. And that is when the 2G scam also happened. And 2012 becomes then the year in which the Manmohan Singh government lost control in some ways over the economy and over the polity. And then of course the downslide after that.
So what's the game plan? We can open it up at any time.
Take a couple of questions,
Okay.
and then come back to you.
Okay.
Audience questions? Please keep it short.
If you can also introduce yourself, it will be very
Yeah.
useful. Thank you so much.
That would be nice.
Rahul Tripathi from Goa University. I teach political science, so an interest in politics is obviously obvious. Would like to go back to 91 and as told to us by another Patrakar who had access to corridors of power at that time, that there were two drafts of the budgets that were prepared. The first draft that was shown by Manmohan Singh to P.V. Narasimha Rao, he rejected it entirely and said that no, this is not what I expected. And then there was another draft that was prepared. I mean, is that true from what you would?
See, what happened was that Yashwant Sinha was the finance minister in December 90. And Chandrasekhar had authorized Yashwant Sinha to approach the International Monetary Fund for a balance of payment support because they knew we were getting into trouble. So Yashwant Sinha sent Rangarajan, who was deputy governor, and Deepak Nair, who was chief economic advisor, on a secret mission to the IMF to negotiate a loan. As an aside, I can tell you, it just so happens that I was in Washington at the same time. And the Indian executive director in the IMF was a friend of my father, Gopi Arora. And so I went to see him. I called him and said, "Uncle, I'm in Washington, can I come and see you?" So he didn't know who I was. I mean, he just knew me as the son of so and so. He didn't know I was a journalist working with the Economic Times. So he said, "Come, come." So when I went to his office and entered his room, there was Rangarajan and Deepak Nair sitting there. And the two of them hit their hand on the forehead and said, "Gopi, why did you allow this fellow into the room? He's a journalist." So between the three of them, I was sworn to secrecy that I would not report their presence. And it's also a commentary on the way we looked at journalism, that I didn't report the fact. I wrote about this exactly 10 years later in December 2000, when I was with Rohit. I was editor of Financial Express. I then wrote a column on what happened in December 1990. But we approached the IMF. The IMF then said, "We will give you balance of payment support provided you present a budget in February doing ABCD." So Yashwant Sinha came back with to India and prepared a draft budget speech, which he would have read on the 28th of February. In those days, budget was on 28th of February. And the morning before he could, as you remember, in those days, budget speech was in the evening. The morning before he could present the budget, Rajiv Gandhi withdrew support because he didn't want the IMF conditionalities to be made public, because I think the Congress was intending to go in for an election. And so the government collapsed, and then elections were declared. And you know what happened in those 3 months, March, April, May. In the campaign, Rajiv died, and there was complete chaos. So there was a readily prepared budget speech. On the day Narasimha Rao became Prime Minister, the first briefing was done by Naresh Chandra, who was Cabinet Secretary, who told him, first of all, the nature of the crisis. And Narasimha Rao's immediate response to him was, "Then I should have an economist as my finance minister. I can't have a politician handling all this." So he called up I.G. Patel, who was earlier governor of the Reserve Bank. I.G. declined the job because he had just moved after many years of living in Delhi, London, Washington, to Baroda, where he had built a house. And he said, "Look, I have retired, mentally I have retired. I don't want to come back to Delhi." These things happen, somebody declining a job because I'm now retired, I'm living a quiet life, I've seen it all, I don't want the job. So when he declined the job, the next name Narasimha Rao thought of was Manmohan Singh. And so he became finance minister. And he had a budget speech ready, which was written by Yashwant Sinha. I don't know if you're aware that Yashwant Sinha has an autobiography, the title of which is something like, I'm an original reformer, or I was the first reformer, or something like that, where he says that, look, these are all my ideas, right? So I think Manmohan Singh must have gone to Narasimha Rao with that draft, that we have a statement. Because in a sense, that was the statement that the IMF expected you to make in order for them to release the funding. I think that is where Narasimha Rao's wisdom comes across. He didn't want the speech to go into these details. He said, you have to tell the country what the situation is. It's not about, we are going to decontrol steel, we'll decontrol cement, we will go for flexible exchange rate. These are all the announcements, right? He said, no, don't get into the detail. Tell the country what situation we are in. That is why that speech was about the overall macroeconomic situation and giving positive message that we will get out of this. If you remember, that afternoon, or the next day, forget the sequence of events, the industrial delicensing was announced separately by Minister of State for Industry. I mean, the most radical policy decision, P.J. Kurian. P.J. Kurian was the Minister of State. he was told, you go and give a separate press conference. And through a press conference, the entire edifice of the license permit control Raj was removed. So it's possible that the guidance for the kind of speech that Manmohan Singh gave came from Narasimha Rao. Because after all, Narasimha Rao was thinking like a politician. Manmohan Singh was not yet a politician, which he became later. But at that time, he was just an economist, you know. And he was thinking like an economist. And he had obviously written many budget speeches for finance ministers when he was finance secretary earlier, which were all about the old world. You know, cigarettes will cost more, petrol will cost more, you know, customs on this. Those are the old speeches. So he departed from that framework. And I can't, from memory, tell you the sequence of events, but knowing both the gentlemen, which I do, I mean, Narasimha Rao also I knew very well. He was, you know, in my judgment, he was probably the wisest prime minister we've had. And I use the word wise advisedly. It may not have been charismatic like Nehru or charismatic like Indira or even Atal Bihari Vajpayee. But he was certainly a wise man, yeah, and he understood. I'll just give you one more anecdote on Narasimha Rao. The way he thinks. When there was this IMF budget and the left parties had a massive demonstration from what is that Chowk near North Block, South Block, Vijay Chowk, right? From Vijay Chowk to India Gate. It was a sea of red. It was the biggest left party demonstration in Delhi in recent memory. They brought lakhs of people and there was a sea of red condemning the government for going in for an IMF loan. So I asked Narasimha Rao, I said, sir, what is your response to this? He said, you know, I come from a village and I'm a landowner in a village. In the village, if I go to a peasant and say that I have borrowed money from this landlord and that landlord is expecting me to do free labor on his farm, that landlord expects me to send my wife to his house, the landlord, you know, demands A, B, C, D, who do you think the village will sympathize with? They'll sympathize with me. Yes, I have borrowed money. Yes, IMF is the landlord asking me to do ABCD, but it's not going to hurt me politically. I think that was a judgment call he took, that I have no problem accepting that what we were doing was being done because of a crisis which forced you to borrow money, and the International Monetary Fund was demanding a fundamental change in India's policy. That was a fact. Now, only footnote I would add is that a lot of the policies that the IMF suggested were already part of a draft paper that Montek had prepared when VP Singh was Prime Minister. VP Singh had gone to Malaysia, to Kuala Lumpur, in August 1990, and Montek was still in the Prime Minister's office at that time. On the plane back from Kuala Lumpur, he said to Montek, why is Malaysia so much ahead of us? So Montek said, sir, I'll give you a note on that, what they have done and what we should do. So that document, which is famously known among economists as the M document, which was Montek's, and Montek incidentally has published this in the Economic and Political Weekly on the 25th anniversary of 91. So that was 2016. If you look through the EPW, there's a whole article by Montek where he has made that M document public. So more or less, these are the things we wanted to do. So, you know, when there is this debate in the country, the left accusing the Rao government of doing what the IMF dictated, their defense was, we were anyway planning to do this, except that Rajiv Gandhi did not have the courage to do it. And, Chandrasekhar did not have the courage to do it. Rajiv Gandhi did not allow him to do it, and Narasimha Rao ended up doing it.
One more question.
fact, I'll just add, Tripathi Saab, this racy account is there in 1991, the little book that Dr. Baru referred to. And P.J. Kurian almost getting unreported because the media probably missed most of the story. And in a private conversation, I learned that Naresh Chandra was his main source for that book. So the whole, the racy account of, I wouldn't necessarily agree that only 91 and 1947 were the two dates. I would think of 1971, I would think of 2016, a little later, when the whole digital thing took on the lubrication of our economy to where we are today. But suffice to say that if you guys want to get a first-hand account, a near first-hand account, because Naresh Chandra never wrote his book, he said, I'm a dyed-in-the-wool bureaucrat and इतना लोग कागज लाते हैं, दिखाते हैं, उसको लिखना शुरू कर देंगे तो बड़ा खराब लगेगा. That's how he put it. So, yeah.
Good evening, sir. This is Vensi. So, a question in two parts. You talk about two watershed moments. One, you talk about 1991, and perhaps if you could share a little light on, because 1991 is also when India signs the GATT with IMF and things like that, and its impact, because that's what begins a liberalization policy in terms of education, healthcare, and it has its impact on the people and the states in terms of what is center and what is concurrent. The second question again comes another watershed moment which you refer to in terms of 2012, 2014, and another shift, and again probably it starts in 2008 with a shift from brick and mortar into this digital. And again, you very rightly pointed, it begins with Lehman Brothers, again it continues all the way into Europe. Again, this shift into digital from brick and mortar, if you could also share a little bit about its impact again on the communities in India, how the public react, because you've written so extensively about it.
You see, as far as GATT and WTO are concerned, that was a logical consequence of a change in our approach to trade. Because till then, our whole approach was to follow a protectionist policy, right? High tariffs, high protectionist walls, and inward-looking policy that we had. That shift happens with the decision to go in for trade liberalization. When tariffs, the peak tariff rate was reduced from 151% to something like, I forget now, initially it was brought down from 151% to something around 25% or so. It's a dramatic fall in tariffs. The decision then to go in to WTO was a consequence, was a logical consequence, because there was a change in the global trading structure with the conversion of GATT into WTO. And one thing about India you should remember is that we have a memory of not having been rewarded for being present at the creation of the United Nations. It's a historical memory of the political leadership that when the UN was created, India was still a colony of the British and did not get permanent membership of the UN Security Council, despite the fact that we demanded permanent membership. But the West gave it to China, it did not give it to us, 1945. This historic memory was reinforced again in 1968 when the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty was signed and we had not yet tested. China had already tested and signed the NPT as a nuclear power, which we could not. Our testing happened in 73. So the historical memory of the political leadership has been that we were not present at the creation of important institutions. And in future, we should never make that mistake. Whenever a new international institution is coming into being, we have to be there. And so that was the political thinking behind the decision to go in with the WTO, despite a lot of concerns about what it would mean in terms of opening up, etc., etc. And so that was a natural decision. On your second question, a lot of things have happened over the last 75 years. That is why I go back to Hobsbawm's definition of landmark. What is a landmark? A landmark event is something that historians will remember as the year in which fundamental shifts happen. And in that sense, the movement towards a digital economy happens over a period of time. There are important decisions taken with Aadhaar coming into being, with mobile telephony coming into being. Each of these technological and institutional developments contributed to the creation of a new framework. But those decisions were taken by different governments over a period of time and happened across several years, culminating in an important development. But I don't think I would disagree with Rohit in saying that the arrival of the digital economy happened in a quite as dramatic a manner as the end of the license permit Raj, as the end of trade protectionism. These were decisions taken, overnight. I mean, the impact was overnight. And in that sense, it fundamentally changed the framework for the economy.
So, this 2016, I will submit with due respect to my teacher and former boss. Imagine 2016, April 4th, and I'm just going to talk 9 months, not even the whole year. April 4th, 1 billion Aadhaar digital identities had been issued in India. April 11th, just 7 days later, UPI had been launched, which is today available to every single mochi, every single shop, sitting on the street side, a vendor hawking vegetable, gajar mooli. Today there's 16.58 billion transactions that happened in October alone, in 1 month. And that's a 7.6% increase in over month on month. Same year, 2016, 5th September, someone rose to an AGM and launched a particular telecom service. That telecom service has 480 million people on board today. And the per capita usage of data in a country which was considered, ye kya karega, chowkidar kya karega, data ka, is 30 gigabytes. And it costs 10 cents. On the same year, sir, 2016, the currency demonetization happened, and we are not here to support it, but suffice to say, with all this happening, with this digitization happening, demonetization could be somewhat born, and today it has become part of our lives without thinking. Last but not the least, Bhim was launched again in the same year, December 29, 2016. And today our digital public infrastructure, DPI, there is an effort to export it to 50 countries. And that could possibly pose a challenge in your lifetimes, the young ones here, at least, to the dollar. The major reasoning for DPI and UPI and digital payments is potentially quite intrinsic to the India story. So we're not here to debate whether even 1947 in theory was only a date. It was a culmination of activities around 50 years. So, and it's not the result of any government. So how can we compare 47, 91, 2016? I think to my mind, the critical point which I hear and I learn from this each time I hear Dr. Baru is that adequate appreciation of this 1991 moment amidst Patrakars was not quite there. It was limited to a very limited, to a set of people. And I think even the Economic Times, because the history was going through a big change. It was made pink, famously. It was made more lucid and readable. Political pages were added, which possibly were not the preserve of Economic Times. Business pages came into Times of India. So we're bringing the media side in, then, it was called Commerce Page. And the name itself is so different than Business Times as opposed to Commerce Page, which some of our colleagues used to say commerce. And Commerce Page, go down and the paste-up man will just look at you as if you can wait forever. No problem. There's no priority in the system there. So some of these things were happening all the time, and those of us who didn't quite make it to UPSC exam at that time were very lucky, because we found ourselves in economic journalism. And we didn't know that this will grow up from a kitten into a full-fledged tiger. And we would be considered relative experts. My expertise in history was to simply summarize and to understand what a person was trying to say without getting utterly convinced. And go and check up without the internet at my disposal, and certainly not GPT-4o, which is, I think, the scourge which potentially can hallucinate like crazy. So I think these trends of India's economy, India's story, and Indian journalism were fascinatingly weird around 1991, but I think history started after 2014, right?
Well, on the issue of digital in 2014, no, I know, 2016, 2014, in early 2014, Manish Tiwari, who was the Minister for Information and Broadcasting, called me. I was far away from government. I used to work for a think tank in London. But he called me and said, we are producing a series of short films. I would like you to have a look at them and see if these will work. These films were produced by the Ministry of Information about the coming digital revolution. One of the episodes was exactly this, of how a person in a Bombay skyscraper on the 10th floor can call the vegetable vendor on the ground and order potatoes and tomatoes, and he would deliver these. And you know how mobile phones, mobile telephony would empower the presswala, come and collect a bag of clothes, you'll come and, you know, that idea that this is going to revolutionize the services sector was there in the election campaign. It's an amazing fact, political fact, that these films which were actually produced were not shown. And I think the only reason they were not shown, because I only went to approve or disapprove of them. I mean, Manish wanted me to see, saying, do you think this will click? And I said, of course it will click. But I never found out why they were never shown. But I would imagine the only reason they would not have been shown was because the message was political, while the production was done by the ministry. And someone like Manmohan Singh as Prime Minister would have put his foot down, saying you can't use ministry to produce these things going into an election and use it as a part of an election campaign. So I don't think they have still been shown. But, you know, so the idea was there that this is going to change. And the beneficiary was not the government that actually began the process.
So I think, sir, the messaging is no longer the preserve of the person who formulates it the first time. The message is in the hands of somebody who is heard, who has made it, taken it to scale. And reticence of using government machinery or to message, I mean, some of the biggest blockbusters of the India story today could possibly be, you know, taken credit of by an earlier government. But what they didn't do is their problem. Fact is that somebody knew how to take the ball and hit the goal. And to my mind, Skilling India, Digital India, you know, Make in India, all these, in fact, even Swachh. Gandhiji has started it in that sense, and I don't think the current government is in any way related to Gandhiji's original idea. I mean, he didn't credit it to them. That is probably his problem. So suffice to say that critical thing about the originality is only in the head of the loser. मैंने बोला था, मैं तो लिख चुका था पहले. This is a problem we have encountered in newsrooms all the day. Everybody has written everything before. But then how come you and, you know, probably somebody in your home only remember? because you have heard the story so many times. I think what is really important is to capture this global platform of attention and attention deficit coexisting with it, and explain in simple terms which people can understand. I mean, I had the interesting exposure to the Prime Minister of Jamaica. He was here, I believe, last month, was it? And he wanted to go to Taj Mahal. नहीं देखा था. Taj Mahal जाना चाहता था. Guess what happened? Our government sent him to Banaras. Banaras जाओ. क्या करने का वहाँ पर ताज महल देखने से? No, this was a little earlier than the cloud of 400 AQ. I know you guys live sub 100, so you envy you. And he was made to buy some flower or some Loki Muli, something. And that has become the standard operating procedure for, the current president of France, the visiting Prime Minister of Greece. You do the same good things again and again and again till everybody says India में बहुत बड़ा कोई digital क्रांति आ रही है. कमाल हो रहा है यहाँ तो रागिनी एक character create किया इन्होंने अपने iSpirit वालों ने. And Ragini is just some symbol of how digital empowerment is taking place. So it is taking place, it is a lubricant to the economic growth process, but it is being narrated in a manner that people tend to stop thinking about, E.H. Carr, the famous historian, Hobsbawm was mentioned, मैं भी कुछ मार देता हूँ एक. E.H. Carr was the first book given to us to read. What is history? And Caesar crossing the Rubicon is a thing. Did people not cross the Rubicon before Caesar? Did people not cross the Rubicon after him? They did. But Caesar crossed the Rubicon. So, critical part is, I think, how history has to be grabbed and the attention span of the world tilted towards us. Sir, with due respect.
Yeah, just, I'm Sebastian.
Sebastian.
So, just two quick questions. One is, Manmohan Singh, after the reforms, the structural reforms along with the stabilization, made a statement that the exchange rate, the real effective exchange rate, we will not let it appreciate. We'll hold it at this value, and for very right reasons that, look, India's exports, unlike what everybody had said, actually responded to the reforms by growing at something like 20%. My question is, why wasn't that adhered to? Why was the real effective exchange rate allowed to appreciate? Okay? That's question one. Question two is the following. See, when you look at reforms, the first generation reforms, which involve liberalization, that means removing controls and doing a few things which are essentially academic, at the stroke of a pen you can do it, were wonderful, and we did that very well, there's no doubt about it, and we did it better than anybody else. In fact, the stabilization actually resulted in India's performance post-stabilization, pre-stabilization, if you look at it, was probably the best ever. But when it comes to second generation reforms, which involve detailed work by the government, by the desk, by the bureaucrats, isn't there a fundamental problem? Because I can't think of any second generation reforms other than the National Highway Development Program, maybe a little bit here and there in terms of digital, but those are also stroke of the pen because the market is out there ready to serve. But things like, the reforms required for, let's say, sewerage, sanitation, increasing the healthcare, doing better on that, they've just not come. So isn't there a fundamental bureaucratic incapability? I have tried to describe it in the following way, that when bureaucrats sit down to coordinate, even when it's forced on them by the PM or whatever, they are essentially looking at their turf. They are not looking at public value or social value. How can I maximize and therefore step on each other's toes? The only second generation reform which I can think of which went well was the NHDP. And that happened because of external inputs coming from, the Planning Commission, Gajendra, and then from the IDFC. Okay, but take Swachh Bharat. It was absolutely right for the Prime Minister to pick up a broom and indicate his great commitment, layout finance, okay, and so on. He was indicating that. But when the secretary also does that, and when the entire bureaucracy thinks it's their job to signal and not to create the systems, processes, legal changes and so on, I think there's something wrong. And therefore all of Modi's, great pointers, Swachh Bharat, Make in India, have all been dashed. And isn't that a bureaucratic failure rather than a political failure?
No, absolutely. I see the fundamental difference between the first generation and second generation. First generation required policy change through fiat. The government in Delhi had to simply make an announcement and a policy framework was changed. Whether it's to do with trade policy, industrial policy, exchange rate policy, etc. Going forward, almost every other reform that we talk about is in the hands of state governments. Whether it's sanitation, urban governance, public transportation, drinking water supply, you think of anything that requires policy change, it is state governments that have to do it. And when the national urban renewal mission, rural health mission, all of these were launched in 2004, 2005, the first couple of years of Manmohan Singh's government. For each of these missions, there was a clause that the center will give money to the states provided the states undertake reform, right? And you look at each of these missions. Some states actually undertook reform. Like Tamil Nadu, for example, has a much better rural health care system today than it had 20 years back. Most other states did not. And urban renewal mission, the money was given only if municipal administration was put in place. Elections to municipalities, financial devolution from the state level to the municipal level. All these were conditionalities put in the urban renewal mission. None of that was done. The state chief ministers were not interested. The bureaucracy at the state capital was not interested. Because the politics of this country, there is always this demand for decentralization from the center to the states, but no political pressure for decentralization from the state to the panchayat or the municipality. You do not have functioning municipalities across the country. You do have a few, but by and large you do not. You do not have empowered panchayat system except in a few states. And it is that at that level that all these implementations have to be done, whether it is sweeping streets or whether it is providing drinking water or sanitation, etc. In fact, urban renewal mission, the only thing that state governments did as part of the undertaking was to buy Tata trucks. In fact, Tata buses. In fact, I keep joking that the main beneficiary of the urban renewal mission was the Tata buses. Across the country you have these Tata buses, and they all came out of the urban renewal mission. But that was only one element of much wider governance reform which nobody undertook. And it is the power of the bureaucracy at the state level. No chief minister is willing to empower Zilla Parishads or panchayats, as I said, except in a few states. I mean, Kerala is one good example of a state where the local administration is far more empowered than in most other states.
Okay.
No, honestly, I don't know the answer for the rupee appreciation, why that was allowed. I don't know.
Baru Sahib, a very broad question, because I think I don't read newspapers, print newspapers anymore. I mean, I get 2 or 3 newspapers in my office every morning. They're there, and I think at about the end of the week, I gather some of them and take them home for sundry things. Point I'm making is this: I read newspapers on my phone these days, and I don't read them in great detail unless there is something I really fancy. Now, a few years ago we talked about the end of the printed book, and recently we have been reading about how people are now buying printed books as opposed to reading them digitally. Now my question is this, with newspapers, print newspapers, now or going into the future, and Rohit, I think you would have something to add to this, are we really looking at the end of print newspapers eventually? I mean, the second part could, of course, be, are we looking at the end of newspapers themselves? Because, you know, journalism means everything. Journalism is, social media is journalism these days.
See, first of all, Indian language media, print is still thriving. As literacy improves, as people feel empowered, they want news. I mean, anecdotally, you can see taxi drivers, vegetable vendors reading newspapers. They use mobile phones for entertainment, but they are still reading the circulation of Hindi newspapers, Telugu newspapers, Malayalam newspapers, Bengali newspapers is all rising. So I think those of us who read English newspapers may not be reading as much of the printed news. You use mobile phones. But in the media battle, I mean, Rohit is better placed to answer this than me. I'm more or less out of this business for some time. I think what I see happening in the last few years is the credibility of print has gone up vis-a-vis visual media. People still believe print more than television. Though they may be watching television, I think the credibility of television is actually declined, while the credibility of print is still more than of visual media. And that is why print has survived. It is not as if all newspapers of print are not making money. Of course, almost all of them may be subsidized, cross-subsidized within the publishing business, but they are still there. The Times of India is still there, Hindustan Times is still there, Indian Express is still there. What is gaining ground are independent media. I mean, the credibility of independent media, in my judgment, has gone up sharply in the last couple of years. When you see people are willing to pay money to read The Wire, pay money to read the print, you know, the subscription-based readership of these websites, these online publications has actually gone up. I was quite surprised to hear the kind of revenues that Wire and the print are making. That means people are willing to pay money to read. Indian Express also, online readership of Indian Express has gone up, which is subscription-based. So, which tells me that there is still a hunger for authentic news reporting at a time when television has virtually lost credibility. I don't think, I don't know if everybody would agree, but I don't watch television news at all. I am a classic print, well, I only read my morning newspapers. And of course, we follow news on Twitter or whatever, if you want to keep yourself abreast through the day. But I think credibility is an issue as far as people are concerned. They are seeking more and more credible information. At least that's why some of these online publications are now making money.
With due respect, I think it's not even a question. Simply because it's not an either or thing at all. All of us are very, very promiscuous about how we consume information that is relevant to us. We go to WhatsApp University for a lighter sort of understanding of what is relevant, but sometimes in our professional groups or our family groups, one article pops up which is really relevant to us. So that's one. ChatGPT, Perplexity, Claude, whatever is your preference. They throw in links these days which are leading us to sources of verified information, sometimes unverified and hallucinatory as well, but that's one solution. Likewise, television, it's a matter of preference because it's linear. waste so much time in consuming stuff you don't want to. But clips of television which are relevant to your lives have a way to find their way into your phone. Likewise, I think print, the typical columnist these days puts a copy of their print thing, but on digital and social platforms, and also puts a link there and says behind paywall or not behind paywall. So I think the distribution of how we are consuming things has gone extremely personal, and relevance is there. Certainly the death of a news editor who would decide what will go above the fold and below the fold probably has at one level come down because there's so many competing attention grabbers. But it's also gone up because if, as a communication professional that I've in my first job for the last 10 years or so, I get an article which is on the above the fold in Financial Times, it clearly has more value than something which is tucked on their website or in their Twitter feed or what have you. So there is a hierarchy which is probably there, but I don't know of that many 18-year-olds who care what is being published in the Financial Times, and they think that it's some what dad or uncle reads. It's not for me. In the audience there is Vinay Kamath who can probably tell us a little bit more of how this may play out in the future, and of course Dr. Baru is being modest. He should tell us about the future rather than talk only of the past. But to be clear, these 5 different dharas of knowledge or information flow are coexistent in all our heads, and we are speed dating with each one of them. Why even bother about print ka kya hoga? Kuch nahi hoga, acha hoga. Manzoor-e khuda jo hoga, wohi hoga. But having said that, those journalists were able to, I mean, Rishi sitting at the back of this audience quietly, I go to him and say, e-paper ka clipping bhejo. Page 11, this edition. Now, what am I asking? Am I asking for a newspaper? Or am I asking for an e-paper? Or that clip? Or a link? To my mind, they are not even relevant, Pushkar sir.
Dr. Baru, great to have you in Goa, and it's nice to see you, Rohit, on the panel. Thanks, Pushkar, for organizing. My question is more about the time you spent as a media advisor. How did you engage with the media? What were the problems you faced? Did you have to do course corrections during the day when you saw some adverse news or which put some light on the government or did not put light on the government? And is there a thumb rule of how to interact with the media? And did your colleagues who were ministers, did they engage with the media at the same frequency that you would have wanted them?
Accidental Prime Minister too.
You see, first of all, that was a different era. I didn't have hundreds of TV channels to worry about and Twitter to worry about. There was no social media. Facebook had just come. I remember I was one of the early subscribers on Facebook. I mean, I joined Facebook when I was still in PMO. And Outlook under Vinod Mehta did a cover story on Facebook. And they had me on their cover saying, here is this government official on Facebook, as if it's an accusation. That, oh, why is this fellow there? I mean, today, the Prime Minister is on Twitter. So, the view of social media was very different at that time. But as far as main media is concerned, see, when I came into government, the first thing I looked at was how my predecessors had done this job. I spent a lot of time with H.Y. Sharda Prasad, who was advisor to Indira Gandhi, George Varghese, who was advisor to Indira Gandhi, and H.K. Dua, who was advisor to understand what they were doing. Sharda Prasad said to me, he said, I say, in my time, only 5 people mattered. editor of Times of India, Hindustan Times, Statesman, Hindu, Indian Express. 5 people. I never bothered to meet anybody else.
That sounds easy, you know.
Yeah. Sharda Prasad would interact with only 5 editors during his period, which was through the 60s and 70s. Even by the early 2000s, when the world had changed. Second thing I did was to see how did Vajpayee's team deal. Vajpayee's team was much less partisan than Modi's team, but they had divided the media into friends and enemies already. And the first thing I discovered when I joined the Prime Minister's office, one of the security fellows came to me and said, "Sir, who are the people that you will allow to enter this office with their mobile phones?" So I said, I don't know. What is the rule? Everybody is not allowed to enter with mobile phones? So, no sir, everybody is not allowed. But you can give a list of people who you can allow. I said, show me the list that is there. This was the list that was left behind by Mr. Vajpayee's people. And there were 5 names. So I knew that these were the favored 5 of the previous regime. But I decided that either you allow everybody with the mobile phone or nobody with the mobile phone. So I did not have my favorite list of 5. The change I thought I brought about was to focus on regional media. Manmohan Singh, unfortunately, in the last few years acquired this reputation of being silent and not talking, etc. But the institution that I brought in was that the Prime Minister will address a press conference in every place he visits. Every place he visits. People in Delhi may not pay attention, but he met the media wherever he went, including Port Blair and Andamans. There's media there also. Every place that he went, half an hour would be set aside in his schedule to meet the local press. So hundreds of journalists across the country had the opportunity to sit face to face with the Prime Minister. That was never done before. Normally it's the Delhi media that interacted with the Prime Minister. So that was one institutional change I made, which really helped me bridge the gap between Delhi and the rest of the country. I acquired friendships in Urdu press, in Malayalam press, in Assamese press. I knew people across the country. They would all give me their cards. I had them phone. So if something was happening in Assam, I could call these guys. Shillong, editor of Shillong Times. And I would get a ground level feedback. That was one innovation I brought about, which I think really made a lot of difference. Because even when Delhi media was becoming increasingly hostile, Indian language media till almost the end was not that hostile, because they knew this man. And again, one of the prized things that you could do for the media was take people along with you on the plane, which Modi has stopped. But that was a tradition right through over the years. And I had this thing that I would only take 30 seats were there on the Prime Minister's plane for the media, out of which 3 went to PTI, reporter, cameraman, etc. So 27 seats. I would take 15 to 20 of regional language media. So there was a guy who would fly from, Coimbatore to Delhi to go on a Prime Minister's plane. He would. I met journalists who tell me, "Sahab, first time I'm flying a plane, and that too Prime Minister's plane." Rehnama at Deccan, Siyasat, newspapers that people in Delhi have not even heard of. So that was engaging regional media was, in my view, the most important thing which I was able to do, which built relationships, which helped. Finally, is a class change. The period I was there, most journalists belonged to one's own class, by which I mean went to similar schools, similar colleges, Barkha or Rajdeep or Pranay or, Veer Sangvi or whoever. I mean, these are all guys you knew, you met them over in parties. It was a social circuit. And in that social circuit, you are able to influence in a much more gentle manner. You didn't have to call and shout at somebody or blacklist somebody or get an income tax rate on somebody to get them to do what you wanted them to do. You just call up and say, hey, why are you doing this? Okay, boss, we'll don't do it. It was much more casual. The environment was casual. And the relationships were casual. It's not as divided as it is now. It's now us versus them, we versus the other. That kind of sharp divisions didn't exist. So people wouldn't object. I mean, even someone like Arnab, who was just coming up, he was in Times Now in those days. Even he would take a call from me if I say, Arnab, what are you going on and on? Come on, don't do this. I'll say, okay, boss. He wouldn't mind. But I didn't have to do anything more than simply call and say, hey, come on, stop it. This is not fair. And somewhere the culture then was, okay, we are doing a little more, making a big issue out of nothing. Let's stop it. I don't think today that's possible. Today you have either we are with them or against them. That kind of division has happened. It's unfortunate. And people don't talk to each other. People don't get access. I mean, someone like Siddharth Varadarajan who runs the Wire, nobody will talk to him. Nobody in government will talk to him. Till few years back, he was having some access, where somebody would meet him saying, I will meet you across the road from my house, under that tree. Those kind of access people are still willing to. Today, nobody. So you have journalists who are blacklisted, nobody will talk to them. I mean, certainly Arnab was on my blacklist, but I talked to him and he would take my calls. But that culture is gone. That culture is gone.
Doctor, this advisory and enabling role, it's missed. Is it needed?
This is a call that the top man has to take. Really, honestly, each prime minister has his own style, and they have their own way of doing things. So I guess what they're doing it well because they have enormous reach. So, as I said, I'm the old school.
Just to come to Baru Sahab's rescue. This point about old and new is very stark because of the entry of data and ubiquitous data and cheap data. So therefore, going on Facebook and speaking for 2 hours to the whole world is today in the hands of everyone. Don't forget a time in the licensing system that the TV channels who are entertainment channels actually had to take permission from the government to go live. And the news channels were, in any case, just 6% of the market share if you believe the BARC figures. So today, everybody is not only a news channel, they are also an entertainment channel. No sooner they are members of, say, Facebook or Twitter, they can go live on it, Instagram, they can go live on it. So the game has really changed. And the zone of influencers has expanded significantly. So we can have an offline on how, say, for example, whatever little I do, how I would apportion time between different people. Because time is the only finite resource one has. And therefore, how do you apportion it and how do you speak and how do you... Today you make a call like Baru Sahab talks about, even that will get reported. And he will not do it the second time. Some of these WhatsApp messages are like, they reach the other side faster than they reach the intended reporter or sub-editor. So data is the new oil, as they say, and in media as well. Because mobile लेके इन्होंने सबको allow कर दिया होगा, They will tape him, they will put a video, they will go live from PMO only. What will happen next? So I think it's unfair to compare what Nehru would have done, or what Indira Gandhi would have done, or what Manmohan Singh ji would have done, and today, because game has really changed since 2016.
Hello. My name is Dr. Bandutkan. Now that we are in the middle of the political heated mahal, I just wanted to know from either of the panelists or both. Around 150 countries in the world don't follow EVMs, and some of them are reverted back from an EVM to a paper ballot. And this includes almost 7 important developed countries now. Some of them are reverted back to paper ballot. And there is already this perception in the head that in our country something could be getting wrong. Either of you can imagine whether if society wants the system to be changed to paper ballot in India, would it be either possible, and what would be probably the roadmap, and who would initiate it?
You might suspect what is a communication types responding to your question rather than Dr. Baru. So I had a small role to play in Chief Election Commissioner at one time. S.Y. Qureshi's somewhat defining book called India, the Undocumented Wonder, the Indian Elections. And he credits some of the stuff very kindly to me. And from that came because I toured the country as an election commission representative and went around. You know, we tend to say developed countries, 150 countries. First, the scale and size of the Indian population and the voter at that is like no other country on the planet. Fine. Second, even the great darling of capitalism and this whole new age media, Mr. Elon Musk, what has he done 4 or 5 days back? He has pointed out that India is able to count some 700 million votes, and California is taking 20 days to, and we are able to give the results on the same day. So I think we need to be a little more charitable to our system, and the same politicians, they reserve their little problem with the EVM to when the result is declared. They also win, na? Nobody is winning 100% of the seats in India yet. But no sooner they lose, they say कुछ शक का दायरा है, बहुत बढ़ गया. जीत जाते तो कहते हैं हमारे तो good looks, इसी वजह से हम जीते हैं. So my sense is that EVM को हैक कैसे करेंगे साहब? ये इसको हैक कर सकते हैं हम, लेकिन सॉलिड स्टेट कैलकुलेटर को नहीं हैक कर सकते हम. कैसे करेंगे जरा प्रोफेसर साहब मुझे बता दीजिए. EVM is like a solid state calculator. Okay sir. नहीं अभी बता दीजिए. ऐसी क्या बात है? If that is the case, hacking. Oh, I think the machines are mixed.
I raise only 2 questions. Why are there BJP party members on the board of ECIL and DEL, which are manufacturing?
बोर्ड मेंबर क्या करता है? बोर्ड मेंबर बोर्ड मीटिंग अटेंड करता है. I think
We'll take that up later.
No, let me...
one last question.
Yeah,
Sir, thank you for...
I'll respond to this. You see, I don't know the technicalities, whether these can be manipulated or not. But I think there's a different issue. There's a question of credibility of a system. And when institutional credibility is questioned, then whatever the institution does, even if it does the right thing, doubts arise. The credibility of this system has been hurt by the manner in which the commission has been constituted. There was a procedure for constitution of the commission. People like Mr. Qureshi that he mentioned, or Venkatachalam, Session of course, but after him we've had Gopal Swami, not Venkatachalam, Gopal Swami, Qureshi. These were individuals of very high personal credibility acquired over a lifetime in their respective service. Officers of the IAS will say that this chap's credibility is high, so he's unlikely to. Or the manner in which the commission was constituted was a transparent manner. What has happened is the constitution of the commission as well as the credibility of the individuals has come into question. It is the responsibility of the government to deal with that problem, rather than simply say, no, there's no issue. I think many institutions, credibility has become a big issue. You take the more bizarre ones like ED and CBI. I mean, we had this case against Kejriwal, right? Look at the whole sequence of events. Every fellow who deposed in his favor, ED raided him. After the raid, he deposes against him. It's all documented. When the raid happens, when his first evidence given, then the raid, then the second evidence given. All this is in the public domain. Electoral bonds, you have a raid and the money is given. So when these are in the public domain, institutional credibility has been damaged. Today, if you look at the entire governance system in the country, the only institution that has been able to protect its own credibility is the Reserve Bank of India. Even the armed forces, the selection of the chiefs. When I have some knowledge of that, I'm now affiliated with the think tank of the armed forces, and I meet a lot of these veterans quite frequently. I can tell you that there's a lot of questioning about how did this guy get promoted? Why this person? I'm not saying this has not happened in the past. There were questions raised in the past also, but it is now much more. So even you take an issue like Agnivir, I have sat in meetings, closed door meetings on Agnivir where I know for a fact that the Air Force and Navy were not in favor. Only the Army was in favor. And for technical reasons, I don't want to take time for that. There are technical reasons why the Agnivir system, the Navy said it won't work with us, and the Air Force said it won't work with us. The Army was happy with it. But you made it for everybody. And the Air Chief and the Navy Chief signed on the paper. Why did they sign? So, there are serious questions of credibility of the institutions that are being raised. And it is in the interests of the government of the day to restore the credibility of these institutions. Then all these questions about EVMs, etc. won't be asked. If you had individuals there whom you could trust and who then tell you that, look, we have not allowed any hanky-panky. That's a serious institutional challenge for the country.
I thought that would be one last question.
So, thank you for sharing your wisdom. One last question. The KGB of the East and the CIA of the West have been historically been used for military espionage and influence. But going ahead looks like for both for military influence as well as industrial influence, the intelligence agencies have been used by governments. So what should be India's looking at KGB and CIA in times to come?
Look, every country has an agency that does this job. Every country. At the end of the day, it's your credibility that matters. The R&AW was a very highly credible institution till it went and botched up in Canada and the US. Today their credibility is mud. It's not as if we don't do what the others are doing or others don't do what we are doing. That's not the issue. It is the credibility of the institution. And do whatever you need to do, whatever you have been told to do, but do it in a way in which your credibility is not at stake. And I think today even their credibility has been brought into question after the manner in which we pursued this business in the US. Complete incompetence. I mean, former chiefs of RNW have gone on television and said this is incompetence. So, but I think we should give the lady the last question.
I just had one question. Unlike the time when you were president, and you were meeting a select group of journalists or whoever you gave access to, like you said, regional media. Isn't it important to also get feedback? I mean, isn't interaction also, doesn't it also result in feedback, which the government can take and possibly do better work with that? So do you think that there's any sort of feedback going today from people who are well versed with history, who have understood what issues are and can make changes accordingly? I don't think, for example, that there's enough feedback going back to the government because it's all one-way street. I mean, you don't have...
Honestly, I don't know the answer, but I can tell you one thing. I did get into trouble for allowing open access to everybody. So, early in my tenure, the editor of Panchajanya, which is the RSS publication, Tarun Vijay. See, I'm growing old. I need to have a young man next to me. Tarun Vijay called me up and said, I want to meet the Prime Minister, I want to interview him. So I said, come. As the editor of Panchajanya, he met Manmohan Singh, he interviewed him, he published the interview. But I was attacked for allowing that to happen. And then I had to defend the decision. That access should be given to even critics. You may not like what he writes, but he has every right as the editor of a publication to have the same access that other editors have. So, in my time I gave, anyone who called and said I want the PM, I would, from a Tavleen Singh who was always ranting away to Tarun Vijay, to anybody would call and say I want to meet the power, we would allow that. Never say no to anyone. But today I'm told access is not there for critics, which is their decision.
I don't even know how much access is there for people who write in favor.
That I don't know.
Because we don't have this process. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so it's been a longish evening. So thank you very much, Dr. Baru, for coming to Goa. I know, I wish it would have been for a few days rather than, he arrived this morning and he is going tomorrow. So that's a really, really short visit. So I hope you are able to come for a longer time, possibly even a week. Yeah, definitely. I'll definitely request the committee to consider you for a stay here for at least a month. Yeah, which is what the residency comes with. That's an option. So, your next book, what's it about? Just one sentence.
Well, I wrote a book called India's Power Elite, which was published in 2021. The last chapter of that book was titled Secession of the Successful, in which I argued that an increasing number of Indian elite were leaving the country. And that while in the 1970s, economists like Jagdish Bhagwati wrote about brain drain, there is no public discussion about the impact of this exit. Several people responded to that by saying I should write a whole book on that subject. So my next book is in fact titled Secession of the Successful. And it looks at history of out-migration over the last 100 years, but more specifically over the last 10 years, where I draw attention to the fact that we have become a source of labor, skilled and unskilled, and talent. And there's nobody, we are now beginning to take pride in our diaspora. Yeah? The Prime Minister travels the world and meets overseas Indians and takes great pride. But these are people who have left this country. And there is no public discussion today about brain drain as well as wealth drain. The number of millionaires who now have left this country, given up Indian citizenship, have become residents of Singapore, Dubai, Portugal, Greece, United States, Canada, etc., is increasing. The number of businessmen who now have a foot outside the country. The number of chairmen of companies who run their companies in India living outside India. This is increasing. And there is no public discussion. We take pride in people going out. Indians are doing so well. Satya Nadella is running Microsoft. Big deal. So there is a serious challenge of out-migration of both talent and wealth. Recently, an organization in the United States, Americans called In Diaspora, published some data to show that Indian Americans have invested $40 billion in the American economy. Now I, like Sebastian, we belong to a very old school of thought in economics that says developed countries should invest in developing countries. We are now taking pride that a developing country with a per capita income of $2,000 is investing in a developed country with a per capita income of what, $20,000? The US? I mean, this is reverse flow. And how come that 40 billion is not being invested in India rather than being invested in the US? So my book looks at this whole phenomenon. It's done, it's being published by Penguin. It will come out in early 2025.
Okay, so let's have you here with that book. Definitely.
Wasn't it Narasimha Rao who actually said first time that brain drain is good for India? I remember distinctly.
Sir, everybody said that. Even Manmohan Singh once said that brain drain is brain gain. Yeah. I asked him, how do you say this? And Modi has said it. If you Google and see, almost every Prime Minister has taken pride in this so-called diaspora. We feel somehow proud that our Indians are doing well abroad. I'm questioning that. I'm saying, why have they left this country? They may be doing very well for themselves. But what is it about my country that is allowing this talent to leave and taking pride in their exit? And how come
I'm one of the diaspora who has tried to come back 3 times. This is my 3rd time. Yeah, I'm still trying.
No, I know, and I recognize that as a problem. So there is a problem with us. I mean, I know any number of people like you who have told me in the course of my writing this book, I've met people who say, oh, we want to come back, but this is a problem, that is a problem. And of course in Delhi, pollution is a problem. So there are problems. It's not as if there are no problems. But it's a policy challenge for us to deal with this. We are not dealing with it. That's my point.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Baru, for this wonderful evening. And Rohit, I think it's all right that the two of us were at the sidelines. But thank you so much for coming all the way from Bombay. It's not far, but spending a couple of days with us. And thank you all for coming.